Grant us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favor, and further us with thy continued help, that in all the works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally, by thy mercy, attend everlasting life. Amen. Today I table before the Legislative Assembly the Provincial Auditor's 2020 Report, Volume 2, in accordance with the provisions of Section 14.1 of the Provincial Auditor Act. Presenting petitions. I recognize the member from Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present petitions on behalf of concerned citizens that are calling for enhanced internet services in the tri-community area of La Ronge, Air Ronge, and the Lac La Ronge Indian Band. They go on to describe how inadequate the service currently is. They go on to describe how important high-speed internet access is to families, to a community, to an economy, and in allowing the community to certainly tend to economic opportunities, but also for just basic quality of life, Mr. Speaker. Basic safety, Mr. Speaker. The prayer reads as follows. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Government of Saskatchewan take steps to ensure that high-speed internet is available and affordable for residents of La Ronge, Air Ronge, and the Lac La Ronge Indian Band. These petitions are signed by concerned residents of La Ronge. I so submit.
I recognize the member from Regina Northeast.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to rise today to present a petition from citizens who are opposed to the federal government's decision to impose a carbon tax on the province of Saskatchewan. I would like to read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan take the following action: to cause the Government of Saskatchewan to take the necessary steps to stop the federal government from imposing a carbon tax on the province. Mr. Speaker, this petition is signed by the citizens of Waldheim. I do so present.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon, Willow Grove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I wish to present a petition for a private bill on behalf of the petitioners of the Saskatoon Community Foundation. The prayer of the petition requests to amend an act to incorporate the Saskatoon Community Foundation, to clarify the Foundation's purpose and objectives, and update the act to reflect current administrative practices, and the prayer reads as follows. Wherefore your petitioners humbly pray that your Honourable Assembly may be pleased to amend the Saskatoon Community Foundation Act, being Chapter 1 of the Statutes of Saskatchewan 1994 accordingly, and as in duty bound your petitioners will ever pray. The petition is signed by the Volunteer Board Chair, Curtis Kimpton, Executive Director, Carm Michelenko, and Volunteer Governance Committee Member, Ian Sutherland, of the Saskatoon Community Foundation, and I am pleased to present it on their behalf. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Statements by members. I recognize the member from Regina Rosemont.
Mr. Speaker, I want to recognize an initiative and people that build a very strong community. The new Neighbour to Neighbour program in Rosemont and Mount Royal demonstrates what it means to be a neighbour, strengthens community, and is making a difference for so many. This program has organized community people to help out neighbours. The help includes snow shoveling, isolation check-ins, grocery delivery, seasonal decorating, landfill runs, vehicle boosting, and so many other random acts of kindness. This initiative has been led by the Rosemont Mount Royal Community Association Executive Member Dan Rees, has been fully supported by this dedicated community association, and made possible by the legions of volunteers and helpers, as well as local businesses such as Paul's Mini Mart and Indian Masala, Crawford's No Frills, Juliana Pizza, Mel Bell Designs, Hanger and Rack, and Center Stage Bath and Body. Mr. Speaker, this initiative and these residents demonstrate the best values of Saskatchewan. And at a very challenging time for so many, they've stepped up in an incredibly caring and meaningful way. It's what community is all about. I couldn't be more proud or thankful as their MLA. I'd like to ask all members of this Assembly to join with me in commending Dan Rees, the Rosemont Mount Royal Community Association, and all the incredible volunteers, helpers, and local businesses that make this program happen. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member from Kenora Pelly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, our government made a further commitment towards mental health through a $400,000 investment to provide mental health first aid training to at least one staff member in each Saskatchewan school by the end of 2021. This would make mental health first aid available to students when needed, similar to physical first aid. Mr. Speaker, mental health first aid is a training program developed by the Mental Health Commission of Canada. The in-person training is currently transitioned to be available online by 2021. This move to online will also increase the availability of these resources to remote communities. Mental health first aid can be provided to a person who is developing mental health concern or who is in mental health crisis. Mr. Speaker, the training teaches individuals to recognize the symptoms of mental health problems, how to provide initial help, and how to guide a person towards the appropriate professional help. Studies show that mental health first aid training results in improved mental health literacy and decreased stigmatism towards mental health concerns. Since 2017-18, our government has provided up to $9,000 in grants to each school division for training to build capacity in their staffs related to mental health and student safety. This new funding significantly builds on that commitment. Mr. Speaker, we are very proud of this investment in mental health and are excited to see these resources support our school communities. Thank you.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in solidarity with farmers in India. We're a province rich in agricultural exports, Mr. Speaker. We know the importance of farmers in feeding their people and people beyond their borders. Farmers in India are protesting in Delhi and other cities across India. They're protesting peacefully based on legislation in the Indian Parliament. They're protesting for their livelihood, their land, and their heritage. They're protesting mass civilizations and corporate greed. They are demanding consultations on farm reform bills. And importantly, they are protesting peacefully. But they've been met with violence by the Indian government. Barricades, tear gas, water cannons, beating elderly people. These are not actions befitting peaceful protesters. Despite this senseless violence, the farmers have shown incredible generosity by continuing to provide food and water to police forces. We stand with the protesting farmers in India and commit to standing up against governments using undemocratic means to stop peaceful protests from happening. I call on all members to join me in strongly urging the Indian government to begin a peaceful dialogue with farmers and listen to their people, not wealthy donors and big corporations. We stand with the farmers. It is their democratic right to protest farm reform bills, and we need to stand in solidarity with them as they do so. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member from Regina Walsh Acres.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Difficult times brought on by COVID-19 have been felt in every corner of our province. Saskatchewan is home to 5 of the best junior hockey clubs in the country, and they've been especially hard hit. Not able to get on the ice in front of their dedicated fans, especially those fans here of the Regina Pats in the Queen City. Now, this absence from the rinks has also had an effect on the future education of hockey players on these teams. This year, 354 WHL graduate players, including 73 players from right here in Saskatchewan, attending post-secondary institutions on full WHL scholarships. The University of Saskatchewan leading the way in those post-secondary institutions with 35 WHL graduates, and 18 former WHL players are registered at the University of Regina. Now, Saskatchewan's 5 WHL teams have come together to launch the first ever Hockey Harvest Lottery in support of player scholarship funds. Now, the Hockey Harvest Lottery has been launched not only to give fans in Saskatchewan a chance to take home some cash during a difficult time, but also help enhance the funds in each team's scholarship fund. Mr. Speaker, I now ask all members to please join me in supporting these 5 teams so these young men can continue their hockey and educational careers. Thank you.
I recognize the member from Melford.
Speaker, our government has increased its mental health and addiction support funding to $435 million. But, Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, it's the families and communities who stand with their loved ones on the front line to battle the despair and darkness of anxiety, depression, disorders, and of addictions. With that in mind, 2 friends of mine, Mark Jago and Dr. Robert Steffen, they started a mental health support group to which Laura Alexander, a local nurse, wife, and mother in our community, attends. There, Laura tells of hearing a statement that stuck. We can lose everything else, but if we lose hope, we're in big trouble. Laura said of her work family, we help bring life into the world, ease the suffering of those dying, but COVID-19 has really made the last 8 months challenging both personally and professionally. I found myself struggling, and I recognized the people I love to work with were struggling too. So to do her part in spreading the light of hope, Laura stepped out on a hospital balcony one winter night to build and hang a Light of Hope banner. With 3 strings of Christmas lights, 2 pairs of wet-duty shoes, 12 zip ties, 10 numb fingers, and her husband's David's missing pliers, Laura expressed to her workmates, her town, and to all of us what she has found, Mr. Speaker. Hope brings light into darkness. So thanks to Laura, Robert, Mark, and the countless others who are spreading hope through support groups to those in need across our great province. Viruses are contagious, Mr. Speaker, but so is hope, and hope still beats fear.
Recognize the member from Moose Jaw North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On November 21st, over 300 individuals across Saskatchewan and even as far away as the Yukon tuned in to the 29th annual Moose Jaw Festival of Trees in support of the Moose Jaw Health Foundation. This year, the virtual event was held to fundraise for new state-of-the-art urology equipment for the Dr. F.H. Wigmore Hospital. Mr. Speaker, the Moose Jaw Festival of Trees has become one of the largest and most popular fundraising events in our city. This annual gala is possible because of the support and generosity from so many in our community, and this year, a little creativity and ingenuity on the part of the committee allowed the event to proceed. Mr. Speaker, each year Christmas trees are beautifully decorated in their own unique themes and donated by various community organizations, and then auctioned off to the highest bidders. Though we had to forego the reception this year, many generous donations came from far and wide to support the Hospital Foundation. Mr. Speaker, after all the donations from the auction were tallied, over $117,000 was raised for the new urology equipment. Please join me in congratulating the Moose Jaw Festival of Trees organizers, tree designers, and all the volunteers who made this year's gala another huge success. Thank you.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon, Riversdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to announce the reinstatement of the Community Rink Affordability Grant. to community facilities across Saskatchewan. Around the province, community rinks receive tremendous community support from volunteers at every level and are well used by families, youth, and seniors. Mr. Speaker, we also know that fundraising is an important part of the annual budget for community rinks, and everywhere has been hit hard by the COVID-19 pandemic. The Community Rink Affordability Grant allows for indoor rink enhancements and upgrades and contributes towards the long-term financial upkeep and facilities themselves. By restarting the Community Rink Affordability Grant Program, nearly 400 communities and over 600 indoor curling and skating rinks can register for a $2,500 grant to offset the cost of repairs, health and safety precautions, including COVID-19 related expenditures for the facilities, as well as some operating costs. Registration for the Community Rink Affordability Grant will open Monday, December 14th and run until March 12th, 2021. Beginning Monday, community rinks can register for this grant through Saskatchewan Parks and Recreation Association's website. Thank you to Saskatchewan Parks and Recreation Association for partnering with the government of Saskatchewan to keep skating and curling rinks as an integral part of our communities in Saskatchewan. Thank you.
Question period. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, we reached a sad and sobering milestone in this province's battle with COVID-19. 9 seniors lost their lives in 2 different health facilities in a single day. 9 more families are grieving today in Saskatchewan. So to the Premier, does he agree that it's time to commit the emergency funding to get the increasingly deadly situation in Saskatchewan long-term care under control?
I recognize the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the member opposite for the question. First and foremost, I would offer my condolences to those family members to those families that have lost a family member over the course of the last few days, or whether it's over the course of the entire time that we have been responding to the outbreak of COVID-19 here in Saskatchewan, across the nation and around the world. Mr. Speaker, since the beginning of this pandemic, we have acted on the public health advice that we received from the very competent Chief Medical Health Officer here in the province, Dr. Shahab. That includes advice around a number of measures that were put into place very early with our long-term care facilities and our healthcare facilities. And those measures included the staffing in those facilities and how the staffing operated or moved, or lack of movement between facilities. It included ensuring that we were providing personal protective equipment for those staff members as well as those that may be visiting the facilities. And it included significant measures with respect to visitation, Mr. Speaker. We continue to work with all of our healthcare facilities, our long-term care facilities that are operated by the government, and those that are operated by affiliates here in the province, to ensure that we are providing the safest environment possible. But this, Mr. Speaker, up until recently, that has proved to be very effective. Recently, we have had a couple of outbreaks, Mr. Speaker, with the higher numbers that we have in community transmission, and we're going to continue to work with those facilities individually or as a group to ensure that we're providing the safest environments possible.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The issues in long-term care are not new. This May, I stood with Diane Morgan from here in Regina. Her parents were residents of extended care here in the city. They're now both deceased. But she raised the issues that they experienced of staff shortages, not enough nurses, of crowded conditions, 4 residents to a room, sharing a single bathroom, a bathroom with no door. We called on this government then, as we have so many times, to fix the problems in long-term care, to address these unacceptable conditions. They didn't act. This was predictable, this was preventable, but this government chose not to act. So will the Premier acknowledge today that we have a serious, long-term problem in long-term care, and that it's his job to fix it?
Recognize the Premier.
Speaker, as I had indicated, we took action. We took action very early. We took the action based on the advice that was provided by Dr. Shahab with respect to our long-term care homes to ensure that the operating environment that we have is as safe as it can possibly be, Mr. Speaker. More historically, we have taken action over the course of the last now 13 years to ensure that we are investing not only in healthcare generally, but in long-term care specifically, and more specifically in 15 new long-term care homes across the province, Mr. Speaker. Throughout the COVID and our response to COVID-19 this summer leading into this fall, as I said, we have been cohorting staff in our long-term care facilities, worked very closely with our organized labour leaders to ensure that that can occur so that staff are not moving between facilities here in the province. We have ensured that we had the funding in place to provide the proper and appropriate personal protective equipment for all of those involved, and we've made some significant changes in the access that families have into those care homes, Mr. Speaker, into the ultimately to see their family members. As we move forward, we're going to continue to prioritize those long-term care residents and the staff. They are first in line to receive the vaccine as that becomes available from the federal government. Mr. Speaker, we've taken action very early, and we continue to take action as we start to distribute the vaccines here in the province.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The situation in long-term care in this province has been unacceptable for years, but now for this government to continue to ignore it. Other governments have taken a different route. Quebec committed $100 million for home care, $133 million for added long-term care supports. Ontario committed $500 million to protect seniors in the second wave alone. Even Alberta brought in $170 million to support seniors. Saskatchewan, under this Premier, zero. Not a single extra dime. Mr. Speaker, will this Premier commit to take action to bring forth that emergency funding, to staff our long-term care homes, to reduce the maximum occupancy to 2 residents per room? Mr. Speaker, will he take this action, or is he happy with simply defending the status quo that his party has defended so long despite the deadly consequences?
Recognize the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I recall some conversations I had with the Premier of Quebec, Premier Legault, when Quebec was going through some significant challenges with respect to COVID and the COVID rates that they had in many of their long-term care homes across Quebec. And I think that stands out again as an example of the consequences that occur when COVID-19 does get into areas of our community where the people are more vulnerable, namely into our long-term care homes. As we look at the consequences that occurred in Quebec, we have put measures in place on Dr. Shahab's advice to take every precaution so that that doesn't occur here in the province. We do have a couple of recent outbreaks here, Mr. Speaker. But to answer the Leader of the Opposition's question more specifically with respect to resources being provided to people that will be working in long-term care homes is yes, those resources have been committed through the most recent election campaign. We committed resources for hundreds of continuing care assistants to go into long-term care homes, to go into our home care service here in the province. We have expedited the hiring process for those individuals, and they're actively being searched out as we speak, and the funding has been provided.
Hear, hear. Hear. Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning, Saskatchewan's Chief Medical Health Officer announced that there would be further health service slowdowns of essential services because of the reduction in staff availability due to COVID demand and the number of people, hundreds of healthcare providers, who are isolating or testing positive, 43 of those at Parkside Extendicare alone. Army reservists, we've also learned, are being trained to be deployed in Saskatchewan. The situation here in the province is clearly out of control, and this Premier is clearly in over his head. We have the second highest number of active cases per capita in the entire country. We've got new outbreaks in long-term care and hospitals every day. Does the Premier recognize he needs some help? And has he been reaching out to the federal government? Will there be military support for healthcare delivery here in Saskatchewan?
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I guess just to broaden the answer to that, we have invested over the course of the last number of years and invested heavily in ensuring that we do have additional resources in our healthcare system, whether it be the 900 additional doctors, 4,000 additional nurses, Mr. Speaker, the additional infrastructure that we have across the province. So healthcare has been a priority for this government since we had the honour to form government in 2007. With respect to our work with the federal government through the Council of Federation table and individually as a government of Saskatchewan to the federal government, I chaired a number of meetings in the lead up to the Safe Restart funding that was provided, the $19 billion of which Saskatchewan received close to $400 million, I believe, of that funding and personal protection equipment funding for contact tracing and testing. In addition to those conversations, we have added to that agreement with funding for municipalities and funding for our education sector, of which we flowed through to those entities. Mr. Speaker, we have also reassigned a number of people in the Saskatchewan Public Service to help us with testing and contact tracing, as well as work closely with the federal government to use some of the resources in people that they have here in the province, specifically, I believe, Statistics Canada, people that are employed with Statistics Canada, to help us with some of our contact tracing here as well. My understanding with respect to the military is there is some conversation with respect to the community of Fond du Lac. And there has been some conversation at the Council of Federation table with the military working with distributing the vaccine from the suppliers ultimately to the provinces.
Here, here. Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier references the numbers of healthcare providers. Well, hundreds of those healthcare providers are right now isolating or positive with COVID-19. Hundreds of doctors, nurses, pharmacists spoke out calling for more action to prevent the situation we're in today. This Premier didn't listen. Hundreds of them spoke out also against this Premier's worst back-to-school plan in the entire country. We know that yesterday we heard the Regina Public Schools made the difficult choice to close schools and move to exclusively online learning starting next week. We heard today that Regina Catholic made the same decision. These schools were forced to make this decision in order to keep schools safe because of the failures on COVID-19, to keep students safe, but also because they didn't have enough substitute teachers to be able to keep classes running. It's unclear how many boards will have to follow suit, but what is clear is that between the worst back-to-school plan in the entire country, between the failure to get community transmission of COVID-19 under control, between all of these failures, now we have students wondering what happens next year. We have parents scrambling for childcare. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier admit that this failure to give schools what they needed to stay open and support our families, that this is just one more indictment of his failure on COVID-19 across the board?
Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, as he just did now, yesterday the Leader of the Opposition after question period in the Rotunda in a scrum said, and I quote, "If you left this up to school divisions, don't have public health departments, don't have the resources to deal with this, and they are having to make this up," end quote. Mr. Speaker, I want to assure the members of the House and the public that school divisions have made these decisions with the full cooperation and collaboration of local public health officers. They have access to Dr. Shahab on a regular basis, Mr. Speaker, and school divisions are not, in his words, making it up. Here's the Regina Catholic Schools news release from this morning. Quote, "We are prepared for making this change. Our teachers and support staff are ready to provide learning throughout the regular school day." Mr. Speaker, for the Leader of the Opposition to leave the impression for parents that were tuning in to the news last night, Mr. Speaker, that schools are not accessing the resources of public health and making these decisions, or are simply making it up, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition is often wanting to be the police of misinformation. He's well advised to start with himself.
I recognize the member from Regina Lakeview.
Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we have a great deal of respect for the role and the struggles that school boards have gone through. In fact, in the last 2 days, Regina school boards have done something that the Minister of Education has failed to do, and that's show leadership. Regina Public says they simply don't have the teachers and staff available to keep things running. There simply aren't enough substitute teachers to keep their doors open. And Regina Catholic has made the same move because of increased transmission and, quote, fear and anxiety related to, quote, COVID, end quote. Mr. Speaker, months ago, school divisions requested provincial funding for more substitute teachers, but that Sask Party government didn't provide the support. Will the minister admit that he's made a mistake, and will he ensure that schools have enough resources to safely reopen their doors in the new year?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member for her question. Mr. Speaker, I'll remind the House that this budget included the highest funding in terms of operations for school divisions in the province's history, and that was before this government allocated up to $150 million for additional resources, like adding additional staff, like adding additional teachers, like providing for technology for school divisions, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is a part of the best back-to-school plan that was presented across the country, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, this provides the flexibility for times during a global pandemic when school divisions feel it is the best thing to do for their teachers and for their students to move to a different level, providing that flexibility, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the members opposite suggesting that we mandate this across the province, or do they believe that it should be the decision of the local school divisions in using the resources that they've been made available by the province to make those decisions?
I recognize the member from Regina Lakeview.
Mr. Speaker, I know that that minister is new to his role, but I would suggest instead of spouting those old, tired, discredited lines that he's been handed, he get out in schools and understand the challenges that they are under, Mr. Speaker, that predated this pandemic. But we know, Mr. Speaker, in spite of all of this, that government is sitting on hundreds of millions of dollars in their contingency fund, while school boards are left to do the heavy lifting. The minister says that he has the best plan in the country, but folks on the ground, Mr. Speaker, teachers, the admin staff and school boards, they know that that simply is not the case. If the minister's plan was working, we wouldn't have boards being forced to go back into lockdown, leaving parents scrambling to find childcare for their children. What is that minister's plan for parents who are trapped without childcare now that schools have cancelled in-person classes? And what is his plan to make sure that parents aren't forced out of the workforce when schools shut down again?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, there are so many inaccuracies that are coming from the members opposite in terms of the premise of the question, or frankly what the Leader of the Opposition has to say when it comes time either in the House or outside the House when he's speaking to the media. Reports that parents will read and they'll see, Mr. Speaker. So I want to be very clear. We have provided additional capacity in terms of funding of up to over $150 million. And, Mr. Speaker, we will be announcing in the coming days the next phase of that funding that will be allocated to school divisions, Mr. Speaker. I've had an opportunity to talk with several board chairs, with the SSBA, Mr. Speaker, and I think that they have certainly appreciate the funding that has been provided by this provincial government in the midst of a global pandemic, and the discretion as school divisions to make the decisions that are best for their schools, for their teachers, for their students, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, that's the way that we are going to continue to provide that support to school divisions during a time that is difficult for everybody, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member from Regina Lakeview.
Mr. Speaker, so much support that they have to close their doors on Monday due to lack of staff and due to a lack of support from this government and that minister. The question was this, and I'm going to put it very simply to the minister. What is your plan for parents who are finding themselves having to scramble between their need to work and their need to supervise their children at home because that minister has given up and abdicated his duty to these school divisions?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and certainly, Mr. Speaker, appreciate the school divisions giving as much time as possible as they could to parents to notify them that for at least 2 weeks in the case of Regina, 1 week before the school break, that is well known to everybody, that's going to already take place, and 1 week after the school break, that school is going to be transitioning to distance learning, Mr. Speaker. And so we expect that parents will be making those arrangements, Mr. Speaker, to be able to allow for their children to continue to participate in the school setting, Mr. Speaker. But in terms of abdicating my responsibility, Mr. Speaker, I would just quote, and I would say this, quote, people in Saskatchewan education support their local board's autonomy and know that decisions are better when they're locally made. Mr. Speaker, that was a year ago from the new member from Regina University. Mr. Speaker, I know there's not going to be a lot that we agree with in this House, but that's one area that we certainly can agree on.
I recognize the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, things in our correctional facilities are getting more and more dire. Today's auditor's report is a reminder that dismal medical care and overcapacity in our jails is a perennial issue. Over the course of 10 days, the number of staff and inmates at Saskatoon Correctional Centre with COVID-19 went from 0 to 142 and climbing. I've just heard of a rise of inmate cases at Prince Albert Corrections. It's safe to say, Mr. Speaker, that COVID-19 is in nearly every jail in Saskatchewan. This doesn't just put inmates and staff at risk, it puts our entire healthcare system at risk if dozens of new patients get COVID-19 in our jails. How did the minister allow things to go so badly, and how does she have no interest at all in getting this problem under control?
I recognize the Minister of Corrections, Policing and Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, we too are concerned with the outbreak at Saskatoon and obviously our other correctional facilities throughout the province. And of course, we are concerned with how COVID entered the facility. Our main focus is managing the spread and keeping our staff and offenders as safe as is possible. However, we know that COVID-19 spreads by not following proper public health protocols. And sometimes, quite frankly, we really don't know how the virus moves and how it moves into spaces. The measures we have in place, including mask wearing, practicing proper hand hygiene, and quarantining new arrivals, have been effective. It's only been since November that we had an outbreak with respect to the offenders. Our focus is working with public health officials to address the outbreak and ensure that the measures we have in place are being followed at our other institutions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it's not just this side of the House that has serious questions about the capabilities of that minister. Now the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples is calling on the minister to resign. I quote, Minister Tell has fumbled the ball in her role as minister responsible to Saskatchewan's correctional facilities. People are now facing a death sentence, end quote. Loved ones of inmates have picketed. Lawyers have called for action. Staff at Legal Aid are sounding the alarm. It's clear that this minister just isn't up to the job, and her failure is putting our entire healthcare system at risk. What does the minister have to say for those facing a death sentence due to her inaction?
I recognize the Minister of Corrections, Policing and Public Safety.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I repeat that we are deeply concerned with the outbreak at Saskatoon Correctional Centre and our other correctional facilities. Since the start of the pandemic, our focus has been on keeping the virus out of our correctional facilities, and quite frankly, the staff, ministry officials have been on the ground implementing procedures and processes that did keep the virus out of our facilities right across the province. It's only when we have community spread that, and the increase in numbers that is when the virus ended up in our correctional facilities. We have seen other provinces impacted by COVID-19 outbreaks within their correctional systems and have been focused on deploying the best efforts here in Saskatchewan. That is why we took strict measures very early on, Mr. Speaker, in consultation with public health officials and throughout the pandemic to protect both staff and offenders. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the fact that the government doesn't know how the virus got into our jails is one thing, but the Minister of Corrections and Policing doubled down last week and admitted not only that she doesn't know how, but that she doesn't care to find out. Those were the minister's own words last week. In her report today, the auditor points to ineffective primary medical care in correction centres as a contributing factor to transmission, yet the minister in charge is seemingly clueless. How on earth is that acceptable, Mr. Speaker? Does this minister really think she's qualified to be a minister?
I recognize the Minister of Corrections, Policing and Public Safety.
I understand and appreciate that corrections officers and offenders are extremely anxious. We know our facilities are crowded. Enhanced cleaning and mandatory masking are in place and have been for some time. 2 on-site facilities will soon be operational, which should alleviate some of the crowding issues. A remand center is being designed and will be built in the very near future. Nursing staff are on site at our facilities, and enhanced cleaning and masking are in place. If more extensive medical care is required, we will ensure that the care is provided, no different than people living in our community accessing our healthcare system. We had no COVID outbreaks at first until the last time here in November. Staff and officials were all hands on deck, and I give them extraordinary credit for the work that they did to keep COVID out of our facilities. However, the numbers increase in the community, and despite our best efforts, we see infections. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Introduction of bills.
Honourable Mr. White.
The Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that Bill number 5, the Business Corporations Act 2020, be now introduced and read a first time.
Moved by the Minister of Justice that Bill number 5 be now introduced and read a first time. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall the bill be read a second time? I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Wyatt.
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that Bill number 6, the Business Corporations Consequential Amendment Act 2020, a bilingual bill, be now introduced and read a first time.
It is being moved by the Minister of Justice that Bill number 6 be now introduced and read a first time. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall the bill be read a second time? I recognize the Minister of Justice. Next city.
Honourable Mr. Wyatt.
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 7, the Marriage Act 2020, a bilingual bill, be now introduced and read a first time.
It has been moved by the Minister of Justice that Bill number 7 be now introduced and read a first time. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall the bill be read a second time? I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Next sitting, Mr. Speaker.
Next city.
Item number 4, Honourable Mr. Wyatt.
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 8, the Marriage Consequential Amendment Act 2020, be now introduced and read a first time.
Moved by the Minister of Justice that Bill number 8 be now introduced and read a first time. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall the bill be read a second time? I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Next sitting, Mr. Speaker.
Next sitting.
Honourable Mr. Wyant.
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 9, the Miscellaneous Statutes Appeal Provisions Amendment Act 2020, be now introduced and read a first time.
It has been moved by the Minister of Justice that Bill number 9 be now introduced and read a first time. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall the bill be read a second time? I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Next sitting, Mr. Speaker.
Next sitting.
6, Honourable Mr. Wyant.
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 10, the Miscellaneous Statutes Appeal Provisions Amendment Act number 2, a bilingual bill, be now introduced and read a first time.
It has been moved by the Minister of Justice that Bill number 10 be now introduced and read a first time. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt this motion? Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall the bill be read a second time? I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Next sitting, Mr. Speaker.
Next sitting.
Number 7, Honourable Mr. Wyant.
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 11, the Statute Law Amendment Act 2020, be now introduced and read a first time.
It has been moved by the Minister of Justice that Bill number 11 be now introduced and read a first time. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall the bill be read a second time? I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Next sitting, Mr. Speaker.
Next sitting.
Item 8, Honourable Ms. Ross.
I recognize the Minister of Parks, Culture, Sports and Status of Women.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move Bill number 12, the Wanuskewin Heritage Park Amendment Act 2020, be now introduced and read a first time.
Minister of Parks, Culture and Sport that Bill number 12 be now introduced and read a first time. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall the bill be read a second time? I recognize the Minister of Parks.
Next sitting, Mr. Speaker.
Next sitting.
Item number 9, Honourable Ms. Ross.
I recognize the Minister of Parks.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 13, the Doukhobor of Canada CCUB Trust Fund Amendment and Repeal Act 2020 be now introduced and read a first time.
It has been moved by the Minister of Parks, Culture and Sport that Bill number 13 be now introduced and read a first time. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall the bill be read a second time? I recognize the Minister of Parks.
Next sitting, Mr. Speaker.
Next sitting. Orders of the day.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to ask leave to move a motion regarding the number of members on the Standing Committee on Public Accounts.
The Government House Leader has requested leave to move a motion regarding the number of members on the Standing Committee on Public Accounts. Is leave granted? Leave has been granted. The Government House Leader may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would move that notwithstanding Rules 121 and 142 sub 1, the composition of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts shall consist of 8 members, including 2 opposition members for the duration of the 29th legislature.
The Government House Leader has moved that notwithstanding Rules 121 and 142.1, the composition of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts shall consist of 8 members, including 2 opposition members for the duration of the 29th legislature. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. Why is the opposition House Leader on her feet?
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to move a motion regarding membership to the Standing Committee on Public Accounts.
The opposition House Leaders requested leave to move a motion regarding membership to the Standing Committee on Public Accounts. Is leave granted? Leave has been granted. The opposition House Leader may proceed.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Alina Young, member for Regina University, be added to the membership of the Standing Committee of Public Accounts.
The opposition House Leader has moved that Alina Young, the member for Regina University, be added to the membership of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. Why is the Government House Leader on his feet?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request leave to move a motion regarding membership to the Standing Committee on Privileges.
The Government House Leader has requested leave to move a motion regarding membership to the Standing Committee on Privileges. Is leave granted? Leave has been granted. The Government House Leader may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that Colleen Young, member for Lloydminster, be added to the membership of the Standing Committee on Privileges.
Here, here.
The Government House Leader has moved that Colleen Young, member for Lloydminster, be added to the membership of the Standing Committee on Privileges. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. Presenting reports by standing or special committees. Orders of the day. Special order.
On the response to the throne speech, moved by Mr. Francis, seconded by Mr. Friesen, and the amendment moved by Ms. Saar, seconded by Ms. Young. Mr. Bradshaw.
I recognize the Minister of Government Relations.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As always, it's a privilege to stand in this House. It is such a different feeling, though, standing in this House this time as opposed to the 20 other speeches from the throne that I'd responded to. No masks, of course, no plexiglass, no seatmate. We're spread apart. Mr. Speaker, you know, it's all part of the pandemic, and it's what we all have to go through. There's only one thing of the way this House is set up that I always kind of hoped it would have happened back in the old format, is having government members on the opposition side. And we came very, very close a couple of elections. But this is the first time that we've actually managed members on the from the government party on the opposition side, even though we came very close the last couple of elections. And if it wasn't for a couple of 11th hour mail-in ballots, we might have even had more on that side, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I do want to first of all congratulate you on being elected to that chair. Of course, we were both elected in 1999. That's a long time ago, and you've seen a lot of goings-on in this House, and I think you're very well equipped to take on that role, so congratulations to you, as well as the member from Saskatchewan Rivers taking on that role. She'll do great in that role. I also want to quickly thank the former Speaker, the member from Coronation Park, and the work that he did, not only in the Speaker's chair, but even more importantly, for our party and widening the tent party. You know, I had the opportunity, even though Indian Head was a targeted seat, I had the opportunity to get away a little bit from Indian Head Milestone and do some door knocking in Coronation Park. And I would say that there's a lot of constituencies. When you go to the door, you bring up the Premier, you bring up the party, and that sells that person as far as which way they're going to vote. But I would say that there is one constituency that I've knocked in, and I've knocked in a few, even though I was in a targeted constituency. I was able to get away and knock in, for example, Coronation Park, and the member of of our party, I think, had as much name recognition as the Premier and as the party. He drew as many votes because of the work that he did in the many minority communities, and I just think he really needs to be commended for that, whether he's in the Speaker's chair or in his seat as the MLA for Coronation Park. He has done a great job, so I want to thank him for that. I want to also congratulate all the new members. You know, for you new members, this is not new to you. You're first time in this house, you've been wearing a mask, and the seats are set up this way, and this is not new to you. This is the way it always has been. For us, it's a little bit different. It's a little bit takes a little getting used to. But congratulations to all the new members. I hope your time in here is, is enjoyable, and you serve your constituents well. I'm sure you will. I want to congratulate all the returning members, of course. Anytime you put your name on a ballot, you do put yourself up for scrutiny, and that's not always the easiest thing. And I've been fortunate enough to be successful in 6 elections, but I just think each election, I remember being interviewed early on and talking to the local newspaper and feeling nervous as to what the outcome would be. And a lot of people can say, oh, you shouldn't have any problem. That isn't what I feel. That's not how I feel. And I think it's a little evident when you look at most recently in some of the municipal elections. The change in mayor's seat here in Regina, that came as a bit of a surprise. Mayor Fougere, I think, has served the city well, but when your time is up and the voters have decided to go a different direction, you are quite often the one with your name on the ballot and feel very vulnerable. And that happened into a number of communities regarding the municipal election. And it happened twice on our side. I know it happened a few times on that side, but we're really going to miss Tina Beaudry-Miller and Eric Lawson from our benches. When you get elected and serve for a term, for 4 years with members, you really become a family. You really do become connected. And for the members that are here for the first time, this is really a different time because you don't have a seatmate. We always, you would always be paired with a person, whether you like them or not. You're always paired with a person. And you really got to know that seatmate. I mean, I was with the member from Kenora for quite a few years, and whether you liked them or not, you were seatmates. You spent a lot of time together. And you really do become a family here. And so, number one, we're not as close together, which is unfortunate. We don't get to go, before the chairs were set up the way they were, there was this bar that went around, and you would talk to somebody against the back wall and I think there is as many good constituency solutions determined behind the bar when you were talking with ministers or members. And unfortunately, that isn't the case because the bar is gone, which would really be upsetting to the former member from Arm River when he was sitting in the Speaker's chair one time and people were bantering back and forth. And the Speaker said, take it out behind the bar. But he was from Arm River, and that's how they solved it, is taking it out behind the bar. But this was a different way of settling it. And so we're going to miss that. And this will all change. This will all change, and we'll get back to more of a normal. It may be a different normal, but more of a normal. But, the one thing that I think, and again, this is just knowledge for the new members, and for any of the members that have been here for a while, the thing that I am going to be missing the most about this new setup and the new COVID rules is Thursday afternoon when the member of from Lloydminster would bring so much food into that back lounge. I can put up with the plexiglass and I can put up with the separation, but I cannot put up with missing your Thursday morning / early afternoon suppers or lunches, where we'd all drive home and have a hard time staying awake because we all ate too much there. So anyway, so it is a different time. I'm certainly thrilled to be back. I don't know if ever getting to come back to this place ever gets old. I hope it doesn't. It sure hasn't for me, even though people will say, oh, you shouldn't have any problem. I had a candidate that ran against me that ran a very strong campaign. He was very active before the writ was dropped and very active during the writ, Mr. Speaker. And I just remember he for the most part, he stayed pretty much to the party lines, but he did go after me a couple times, and I found it interesting because what we're hearing on the doorsteps is one of his attack points is, well, when's the last time the member has been on your doorstep? And I don't door knock in between elections. I door knock during the election, and I go to a ton of fowl suppers when there are fowl suppers, and I go to a pile of sports days and parades, and that's how you engage with the constituents for the most part in Indian Head Milestone. And he was kind of, talking about, well, when's the last time a SAS Party member has been on your doorstep? And I really had to think, it was 03 that I ran against Lawrence Scott, and the NDP really haven't put a candidate in that constituency for the last, what would that be, 17 years, and he's going around saying, when is the last time the SAS Party's been on your doorstep? The question is, when is the last time the NDP have been in the constituency, Mr. Speaker? The other thing that was a bit of an attack point is he also was talking quite a bit about the length of time that I've been here, and I have been here for probably quite a while, as long as you, Mr. Speaker, and look at you, you're right up there in the dais, Mr. Speaker, but he was saying that 21 years is enough. It's time for a change, and every time that I heard that, and I saw it on a brochure, all I could think of is a member from Athabasca. Because he was here for, if I've been here for 21, he's been here for 27 or 28 years, Mr. Speaker, and so if maybe it was, I'm a little past my best before date, what does that make the member from Athabasca? Way past his best before date. But anyway, that's enough about the election. I do want to thank a number of people that made my entering back into this place a reality. Because again, anybody that puts a name on a ballot realizes that you do not come into this house alone. You come into this house with a lot of people behind you, and it's a really humbling experience I found each and every time, whether it was the first time to this time. You just are quite amazed at how people stand behind you and the work that they'll put in and the effort they'll put in so that you can kind of reach your dream and your goal of representing that constituency. And I'm very, very lucky to have a strong team. A lot of them have been with me for a number of elections. I had a brand new campaign manager this time. Alicia Bay was my campaign manager from Pilot Butte. She was saying that it was nice to get out of the minister's office for a month or so. From the waiver from, that's in for the waiver, member from Weyburn Big Muddy. But she was a great campaign manager, and I felt sorry for her. She's run a number of campaigns, and she had an idea of the way the campaign would run, and I think her ideas were extremely solid. Her problem was that she kind of had an old dog for a candidate that didn't want to learn new tricks. And so, the voter IDing, we had a pretty good idea, but I just didn't do it quite the way that I think she had wanted me to. And it took us a little while to find our common ground, but we did it. She also had mentioned I should tweet quite often, and that was new to me, and I tried to tweet quite often, whether it was effective or not. But I want to thank Alicia for, putting up with me, but also broadening my idea of what it takes to get elected, and she did a great job. A number of other people I need to thank is my business manager, who has been with me for 5 elections. Dwayne Etner does a great job as a business manager, and so it's always nice when you're going into a campaign and you've got to kind of fill these different roles. When some people return year after year, it just kind of takes the pressure off, because it was done very well in the past, and it was done very well this time again. I had so many people that put up signs. That is one thing I will say is the opposition, the member that ran against me, was quite aggressive with the sign locations. He had a lot of signs out, and that was all nice and dandy, but what it made me do is, normally we ordered an X amount of signs for every election, we always have, but when so many of our supporters saw orange signs on their neighbors' lawns, they wanted signs. We went through twice as many signs thanks to the opposition, which is really kind of weird that you would say that, but it certainly increased our sign location. And all the people that put up those signs, whether it was from Jim Williams to Jeff Brown and Milestone to Bruce Olson and Dwayne Thieker, so many others that put up signs, and too many to mention, but I want to thank them all. And finally, I just want to thank, we had my office manager, who is also my constituency assistant, Nicole Etner-McCullough, who just does an absolutely great job in my office, but also does a great job running the campaign, not running the campaign, but keeping consistency in the campaign, and just does a great job. I can't say enough about Nicole. Not only is she an employer, but she's a very good friend, and such a link within the constituency with her daughters growing up there, and and them running a business by McLean, Blair's Ag Services, just a great person to be associated with and to help me with my campaign. Finally, other people have mentioned it. I'm going to be very quick. I want to also thank my family. Cindy, who is a registered nurse, retired in June, Mr. Speaker, and then went back to work in August at the private surgery center, Mr. Speaker, and I think it was, I had quite a bit of free time right through summer, and she'd retired and she had quite a bit of free time, so then we realized that wasn't going to work very good. So she went back to work, Mr. Speaker, just in case I wasn't successful during the election, but I was, and so I want to thank her for the support. And our two sons who, you know, really are not very politically engaged, I guess you would say.